It's well known that in the 90s, Vince McMahon was all in on the idea of creating wrestlers with jobs gimmicks that, for the most part, didn't go over well. That's right, it was the era of some pretty terrible characters such as Phantasio, Abe Knuckleball Schwartz, and Thurman Sparky Plugg. But of course, this wasn't the only time he would fall back on this idea, as throughout WWE's history, the boss has been known to slip one of these in again from time to time, with them on occasion even ending up being successful. So join us today as we take a look at the most notable of these in Wrestlers with Jobs, Wrestling's Greatest Occupational Gimmicks. And since we're going to be looking at some not-so-good examples over the course of this video, let's start off on a positive note by covering one of the better ones, someone who was able to have 2 full runs with the company, at points even reaching the main event scene, and that's the Big Boss Man. Yes, back in the late 90s, Ray Traylor was able to successfully morph his character into more of a vicious heel, giving it new life all over again, but before that, his first run would see him debut in 1988 as a corrections officer turned pro wrestler, one who was ready to offer law and order to all of the WWF roster. And while this would initially see him wrestle as a heel, forming the Twin Towers team with Hakeem as they got involved in feuds with the likes of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, come 1990, fans would have fallen in love with the Georgia Boy, forcing the company to turn him face. After that then, the Big Boss Man would act on the side of good as he got into memorable programs with the likes of Mr. Perfect and Nails, the latter of which even saw him take part in a nightstick on a pole match at Survivor Series 1992. By the time it got to 1993, though, things would have changed, as at this point, the fan favorite would take one of the big money contracts being offered up by Ted Turner and jump ship to World Championship Wrestling for a while. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story, as by 1998, the Big Boss Man would have returned to Vince McMahon's promotion, and during this run, Traylor, who came to the ring in SWAT gear resembling what the Shield would one day wear, would become a notable member of the corporation, helping the boss to get one over on the likes of Steve Austin and The Undertaker, the latter of whom he took on inside Hell in a Cell at WrestleMania 15. But that wasn't all he was doing, because upon entering the hardcore division soon after this, he'd also start a feud with Al Snow, one which led to perhaps the worst match in the company's history, the Kennel from Hell. On top of this, he'd also get into a program with then WWF champion The Big Show that saw him at one point descend into full comic book supervillainy when he invaded the champ's father's funeral and hijacked the body, driving off with the coffin attached to the back of his car from there. Yes, it was a rare case of the second run perhaps being even better than the first, and a sign that the man behind the gimmick was able to evolve with the time. But that said, for all the success his Attitude Era incarnation had, it was the first run of Ray Traylor that would ultimately give us his feud with the next entry in this video, the Mountie. Now, for those who don't remember the Mountie, he was basically meant to be the Canadian mirror of the Big Boss Man, with his police garb instead coming in the form of his traditional Great White North gear. And the reason for this was that the man playing the character, Jacques Rougeau, was a French-Canadian himself, a badge of honor he wore with pride as, starting in 1991, he'd split from his tag partner and real-life brother Raymond Rougeau and morph into the villainous Mountie instead. But that wouldn't be the case everywhere he went as it happened, because, like Bret Hart years after him, whenever the Mountie ventured up north, he'd be portrayed as a babyface instead, someone fighting for the good of all his fellow countrymen rather than the dastardly heel he'd been down in the States. And this was largely because the Canadian Mountie force would take umbrage with any attempts to make them look villainous, forcing WWF to change tact whenever they were in that area. Of course, while he may have been the good guy up north though, back down below the borderline, he'd continue making life a living hell for any baby faces he came up against, with the Big Boss Man being a particular target of his, as Rougeau made it his early mission to rid the WWF of the Cobb County Corrections Officer once and for all. That was what led to the two finally meeting one-on-one at August 1991's SummerSlam then, with this being the bout where the heel Canadian finally got what was coming to him when, after being pinned by his rival, he'd have to spend the night in jail as per a pre-match stipulation. That said, he'd get out soon enough, and come January of 1992, he'd managed to bounce back when he pinned Bret Hart at a live event to briefly become the Intercontinental Champion. And even if this run would end up being stopped mere days later by Rowdy Roddy Piper, it did represent a vote of confidence in what he was doing overall. This same vote of confidence, however, would not be given to our next entry, as despite hoping to make a successful jump over from the world of ice hockey, the Goon would find himself unable to make waves in Vince McMahon's company. Of course, that's hardly the fault of Bill Irwin, the man behind the gimmick, as even by the standards of mid-90s WWF, this one was pretty dead on arrival. But that wasn't to say he didn't give it his all, as after having spent decades prior making a name for himself on the territory circuit, Irwin would jump at the chance to take up the role of the ice hockey player in 1996 when it was offered to him. So from there, being sold to fans as someone so violent they'd been banned from the ice forever, the Goon would start working on the likes of Raw and superstars, usually wrestling fellow undercard talent, but occasionally getting a chance to go up against more established stars like The Undertaker and Jake Roberts. In the end, though, none of this helped him to get over, and so ultimately, he would be dropped soon thereafter, with him leaving the company in unceremonious fashion in March of 1997. And he wouldn't be the only bad gimmick crashing and burning around this time, as, while the Goon was struggling to get fans to believe in him, TL Hopper was struggling to get fans to care at all. Of course, this was another one that could hardly be blamed on the man behind it though, as while the idea of a wrestling hockey star might have been weak, the idea of a wrestling plumber portrayed by journeyman performer Tony Anthony was outright terrible. Yes, let's be honest here, this wasn't a Rhodes family situation where the tag of plumber was used with pride so as to endear working-class fans to the character in question. No, this was one of the worst gimmicks WWE ever produced instead, as coming to the ring with a stained undershirt, low-hanging jeans, and a plunger in hand, TL Hopper would make it his aim to unclog the company of all its trash in complete cartoon fashion. Not that his journey towards this lasted for long, however, because despite getting one notable win during a home improvement match against an opponent we'll get to in a second, Hopper would do very little of importance during his time with the company. And that was why, after disappearing for a while in early 1997, he'd return as Uncle Cletus instead, the manager to the Godwins, with no further reference to his days as a plumber being mentioned from there on in. But then, as we hinted at a moment ago, even he and the Goon weren't the only ones hoping they could forget about a bad gimmick at this time, as the very person who had taken part in the home improvement match with Hopper prior to this was attempting to do the same, and that was Duke the Dumpster Droese. But unlike Hopper and the Goon, this one wouldn't start in 1996. No, it would start a couple of years before that, in fact, as it was in 1994 that Duke Droese was first signed up to a WWF contract, with him quickly being given the gimmick of a garbage man moonlighting as a pro wrestler from there. And this would go as far as to see him come down to the ring still wearing his work gear, all while carrying a trash can behind him and, in the process, creating the assumption that he hadn't clocked out of his day job yet. Yes, it was ripe for jokes about the character being trash, and fans quickly realized this as, despite an early push which saw the newcomer get into a feud with Jerry Lawler, they would fail to get behind Droese in any real numbers. Still, even if he wasn't a hit with audiences, the Dumpster would at least get to break some new ground in WWF when, upon taking a shot to the head with his own trash can during a segment with the King on an episode of Raw, he'd be part of one of the first instances of hardcore wrestling in the company's history, with this being considered such a wild move at the time that Lawler even had to later apologize for it. Following that, though, things would quickly begin to falter, as despite getting a win over a young Hunter Hearst Helmsley at the 1996 Royal Rumble, Droese would be embarrassed by the Greenwich Blue Blood soon after this when he had his hair cut off by him in the ring. Then, once that was done, a brief feud with TL Hopper aside, the Dumpster would come to realize that there was no place for him in the company anymore, what with the direction it was moving that was. And this then would ultimately lead to he and Vince McMahon mutually agreeing to part ways later that year. Yes, by that point, fans were already seeing the first inklings of what would one day develop into the Attitude Era. And while this would go on to reinvigorate the wrestling industry as a whole and see it shed some of the worst habits of its prior years, it wouldn't mean the end of the wrestlers with job gimmicks forever, as not long after it had come to an end in 2002, a popular tag team wrestler of the period would see himself repackaged as Reverend Devon. Now, anyone who even has a passing knowledge of late 90s wrestling will already know that, prior to this, Devon Dudley had found much success as one half of the Dudley Boys, a team that first dominated the Extreme Championship Wrestling Tag Division between 1996 and 1999, all before making the jump over to WWF during the latter year and becoming even bigger stars in the process. Yes, it was during this period that together with the Hardy Boys and Edge and Christian, the Dudleys would take tag team wrestling to new heights with their series of tables, ladders, and chairs matches. Come 2002 though, with the three teams pretty much having done everything they could do together, and the Dudleys in particular already making history by becoming the only duo to ever win the WWF, ECW, and WCW tag team titles, it was felt that the whole act needed to be freshened up. And this meant splitting them, as during the inaugural draft in 2002, Bubba Ray and Devon would find themselves on separate brands for the first time, with the former now getting a run as a babyface on Raw, all while the latter morphed into a new incarnation of himself over on SmackDown. But this incarnation, of course, would see him drop any of the badassery he'd had previously, as instead, he'd become a man of God, albeit a villainous one who, after spending a brief period as Vince McMahon's spiritual advisor, would branch out on his own, often offering sermons to fans in attendance on all the evils of their behavior as he did. And while this never really managed to get over with fans, the gimmick would ultimately be memorable for introducing us all to one of the biggest stars in WWE history. That's right, it was in the role of Devon's deacon that Dave Bautista would first be introduced soon after its inception, with this early exposure serving to give him the launching pad he needed to move on to later stardom. As for the former Dudley boy though, well, things didn't work out quite as well, as even though he did score a pinfall victory of Triple H on the May 9th, 2002 episode of SmackDown, it became clear pretty quickly that the whole thing wasn't working. And that was why, in November of that same year, he would be reunited with Bubba Ray once more, with the two from there going on to reform their powerhouse team and dominate the Red brand all over again. But of course, Reverend Devon wasn't the only tag team performer who had an unusual job for an in-ring performer, as over a decade prior to this, Mike Rotunda was taking on the role of Irwin R. Shyster. And who was Irwin R. Shyster? Well, he was a tax collector from the IRS, one who had come to the WWF to make sure that not only fans were paying their taxes, but that his fellow performers were too. And this would all begin in 1991 when, after a series of promo packages had aired introducing him, Shyster would make his debut by defeating Greg the Hammer Valentine at that year's SummerSlam. After that, the heel would make life hell for a number of babyfaces on the roster, with these including the likes of the Big Boss Man and Bret Hitman Hart. That said, despite this early success, by 1992 it was clear that there was still a piece of the puzzle missing, and that was why, in February of that year, IRS would be paired up with the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, as together they created Money Inc., one of the most successful teams of the early decade. So successful were they, in fact, between then and 1993, they'd hold the WWF Tag Team titles on no less than 3 occasions, with one of these even seeing them get to take on Hulk Hogan and his partner Brutus the Barber Beefcake at WrestleMania 9. It's just a shame then that during the latter year, an injury would force DiBiase to retire from in-ring competition altogether, with him from there moving over to a management role as he formed the $1 Million Corporation. But remaining a close ally to him during this time, IRS would end up becoming a key member of the corporation too, getting into some notable matches here, such as his Intercontinental title bout with Razor Ramon at the 1994 Royal Rumble and his singles showdown with The Undertaker at the same event the following year. After that, though, his appearances would come less and less, and by 1995, after failing to win the IC strap from Shawn Michaels at a live event in Nevada, Mike Rotunda would have called it a day, with him from there moving over to WCW, where he played the similar but legally distinct character of VK Wall Street for a while. Then, in the years following the fall of WCW, he'd make the occasional return to WWE TV, usually showing up as IRS for a nostalgia pop, all while taking up a role as a backstage producer, where he'd get to help the likes of his son, Bray Wyatt, reach even greater heights than him. But of course, before Bray hit it big with his Bayou Cult Leader and Fiend incarnations, he was a struggling member of the Nexus. And as it happened, another member of that group would later take up a more modern version of a wrestler with a job gimmick, with this being David Otunga, legal advisor to various disgruntled roster members. And the reason for this? Well, as it happened, prior to becoming a wrestler, Otunga had legitimately graduated from Harvard Law School, with this making it one of the few wrestlers with job gimmicks that was completely genuine. So using his skills in law, the former NXT rookie would make his first splash when he convinced the WWE roster to stage a walkout on the October 3rd, 2011 episode of Raw in protest of the way on-screen COO Triple H had been running the show. And after making his presence felt with this, he'd return to the ring not long after, where he'd get to have matches against the likes of Randy Orton, The Big Show, and Santino Marella, with all of this leading to Laurinaitis naming him the captain of his team during a 12-man tag at WrestleMania 28. Unfortunately though, this would end up being the high point of Otunga's run. After choosing to take some time off to be with his wife, movie star Jennifer Hudson, not long after, he'd return a few months later with much of his momentum lost. So from there, he'd end up becoming a bit of a jobber to the stars, eating pins left, right, and center, all while briefly working as legal counsel for Alberto Del Rio. And following this, he'd mostly spend his time out of the ring, doing promotional work for WWE behind the scenes and appearing in pre-show panels whenever called upon. Maybe if he'd just been around a little earlier then, he would have been able to offer some legal advice to Mike Shaw and stop him from taking the truly terrible role of Friar Ferguson in 1993. That's right, it was in August of that year, right in the middle of Vince McMahon's obsession with wrestlers having other jobs, that he would create a wrestling monk, someone who was presumably taking a brief break from his godly pursuits so as to step in the ring and batter the living hell out of a series of jobbers. Of course, it's no surprise that this failed to get over with fans then, as, even by the standards of bad mid-90s gimmicks, this one ranks right up there among the worst of them. And it wasn't just fans who were upset either, as after seeing what was going on, the Catholic Church of New York would get involved too, pressuring Vince McMahon to drop the whole thing at this point, lest he feel their wrath. So knowing better than to mess with someone as powerful as the church, the boss would repackage Shaw as Bastion Booger going forward, someone who doesn't exactly fit in with the theme of today's video, but deserves mention anyway for being just about as bad as Friar Ferguson was before him. Yes, Mike Shaw didn't really have a lot of luck during his time with WWF in the mid-90s, and he wasn't the only Mike who would have similar problems there, as years later, after going through a successful spell in ECW as part of the Blue World Order, Mike Bucci would jump to WWE, there being rebranded as Simon Dean. And upon his debut in 2004, Dean would be portrayed as a fitness enthusiast who, with the help of his signature Simon system, planned to help the WWE roster and its fans to get in better shape. Of course, this would make him an easy-to-hate heel then, as, with him regularly berating live audiences for being out of shape, they quickly grew to despise him whenever he came through the curtain. Still, this wasn't going to get the newcomer down, as despite the reactions he was getting, he'd continue to push the benefits of his system, all while defeating a series of jobbers at the same time. That, of course, was before he came up against Bobby Lashley, because when this happened, things would go far differently for Dean. Yes, instead of looking dominant here, the former ECW star would end up getting absolutely obliterated by the Almighty, with him not only being pinned, but also forced to eat 20 double cheeseburgers, then vomit them back up again after the match. And following this, things wouldn't get much better, as despite briefly managing Jim and I, Simon Dean would disappear from TV altogether soon thereafter, with him from there moving to a backstage role before leaving the company in 2007. But while this may represent some of the best and worst of Vince McMahon's wrestlers with job gimmicks, it should be noted that he wasn't the only one doing it, as when WCW wanted to get involved, they could too. And that then was how Curtis Thompson would end up joining the Southern Wrestling Company in 1991, and there be rebranded as FIREBREAKER Chip. Who was FIREBREAKER Chip? Well, he was a fireman. And though it might have looked like this would be a dead-on-arrival gimmick, it actually allowed Thompson to find some early success, as after teaming with Todd Champion to form the Patriots, he'd become a WCW United States Tag Team Champion for a brief time. Of course, it never went much further than that though, as clearly not ready to see a firefighter in the main event, the early 90s wrestling audience would fail to turn him into a star. Still, even having the level of success he did showed that under the right circumstances, an occupational gimmick can work, and it can go a long way towards giving a performer the boost they might need. Sure, there are plenty of examples of it failing miserably, but if we've gotten the likes of the Big Boss Man out of it, then it's at least been worth it for that alone. So the next time you see a wrestler come out to tell you about their day job, don't dismiss it outright. You never know, it could always be more of a Britt Baker than an Isaac Yankem. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.